Hello, Alex.
Hello, everybody out there.
Oh, hold on a second.
We can't hear Alex.
Yeah,
Alex, try that again. Can we hear you
yeah,
now?
yes.
There
Can
you
you
are.
hear me?
We can hear you. Great. And so we are here again, one more week. We are studying in our book club, our 2000 years ago wonderful historical novel book by the author Emmanuel through the mediumship of Francisco Xavier. And this is week 5. This is week 5 already, and we are about a third of the way done with the book.
And we're all in the same place. Alex is back. I'm
Yes.
here. Daniel's back. So we're back to our usual, and we are going to talk about chapters 8 and 9. As I mentioned to you, I decorated the sites with all my little tabs. So I am ready for tonight's discussion, marked up and ready to go. So how do you want to start, Daniel?
Well, I want to say hi to Alex. How are you doing, Alex?
Good. I'm sorry I missed the last week, but I had something that I had to do, so I got like lost in my life here. So I miss you guys. But I read the 2 chapters. I do not saw the video yet, but I will. Well, yeah. So here you go again. 2 more chapters. Sad, really sad, but yeah. Well,
Indeed.
good.
Well, it's great to have you. It's great
Thank
to
you.
have your input and your perspectives. And we're glad to be here.
And I wanted to say hi to somebody because we had a comment on one of our videos.
Oh, from Ana Teresa.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for watching and thanks for your comments. Anna is with me on Team Livia. We're back on Team Livia.
Yes, although I did think that she had some thoughts that she would like to share too. If she only could make the time, which doesn't work so well
I know.
because she's on Central Time as well, and she's got some other things going on. But
Anna, we're reading your comments, and if you're watching the videos, put the comments in the YouTube. We'll include them in our conversations, and can't wait to hear what you think. But we've got Alex here. Alex always tells us what he thinks. So I think we should dive in. These were 2 meaty chapters.
very, very meaty chapters, right? So
Yeah.
we are talking about chapter 8 and chapter 9 of part 1. There's 2 parts to the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can kind of feel like, why there's definitely things changing. Chapter 8 is called On the Great Day of Calvary. Wow. And chapter 9 is called Slander Victorious. 2 important chapters. We see lots of things change. I want to do a quick recap from some major points from last week. I think last week we spent some time talking about the character arc, so to speak, of how both Publius and Livia were sort of veering apart from each other more and more, right? Livia was in the upwards trajectory of, connecting with the spiritual part of her and really focusing on that. And Publius was more and more going the other way and giving himself into his earthly thinking, where he was worried about things of life in general, position, status, and everything else that goes to that. And with the meeting with Jesus, that seems to be a natural wedge, so to speak, between that character arc, because whereas we found Publius, having that meeting with Jesus and going back and retracting to what he was and denying that the healing of his daughter took place because of Jesus. When we see Livia meeting Jesus, she goes the other way, and she doesn't even need to meet him to feel that way. So we really have a very dramatic moment here in the book, because our favorite couple is moving away from each other.
They're our favorite couple now.
Our favorite couple.
I thought we were our favorite couple.
Oh yeah, we are our favorite couple. But I'm talking about in the book. In the book.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to point out, though, you know how I love
and Alex, you do not need to chime in here about us being a favorite couple. You do not need to comment on this whatsoever. You stay out of this one if I were you. There you go.
I wanted to point out, you know how I love taking us back in the book. And you were talking about the character arc. And I think it's important it's easy to forget what we read in the introduction, but I want to point us to page 8, where Emmanuel, the spirit Emmanuel, actually tells us that this is a story about his life. And by now we know that Emmanuel was Publius Lentulus. And on page 8, he talks about that someday, God willing, I shall tell you about the proud patrician Publius Lentulus, so that you may learn something from the dolorous experience of an indifferent and ungrateful soul. So,
and let me just pause really quick to remember, folks, that patrician means nothing else than Roman citizen.
Thank you. I just, whenever I want to get mad at Publius Lentulus, I think about like Emmanuel having this really hard moment, like we've all messed up, and like the hardest thing when you mess up is to like then come clean and tell somebody about what you've done. And so this whole story, every moment I cringe about what Publius Lentulus has done, I have to think back to Emmanuel, who is telling this story about his past, and clearly, over the times has come so far, right? Over the time, he's become such an amazingly enlightened spirit and an enlightened person. But in this book, man, he messed up multiple times, and it really becomes clear in chapter 8 and 9. So I just wanted to point us back there saying, in this moment where we're really like irking, and it's like, man, he is not a guy you want to love right now. But then you remember that he is telling us this story of this indifferent, ungrateful soul, referring to himself, so that we may learn through his painful experiences. And man, are they ever painful?
Yes.
So I just wanted to point us back to that and remind us of that.
And I think that when we talk about chapter 9, we'll see how it gets even more painful in many different ways for reasons that we're going to comment. But I think that's a great point. And I think I would say, like, if we were to do a quick introduction to chapter 8, right, we have the title of On the Great Day of Calvary. And I think we all can connect to the idea that the Calvary is the crucifixion of Jesus, right? These are the key moments of history. And I want, to that same point, I want to stop there really quick and say, we're used to reading the stories of Jesus. We have the New Testament. We have all these wonderful movie recreations. But I just want to point out really quickly to people that this is a recounting of the story by a first-person witness, right? So this is not a work of fiction. This is actually the recollections of the Spirit who lived and was that character, so to speak, right? And I think that it's something that's hard for us to conceive sometimes, because we always reading stories and we're thinking they're fiction. But this one, it's only possible through mediumship, through the mediumship of Francisco Xavier, that actually lets the Spirit who lived that adventure, so to speak, come back and tell us firsthand what happened. So in a roundabout way, what we are getting here is the historical information that is not always present in the other historical sources that we have access to and that have withstood the test of time, which I think is fascinating. So we are having an inside track to real history, which I personally find incredible. And when we go to chapter 9 and we talked about the way in which the decision was, at the end of chapter 8, the way the decision was made about what to do with Jesus, it blows my mind in many different ways, right? So I wanted to stop right there. And I think chapter 8 starts exactly with that. We find Publius mulling over the debate on whether he should trust his wife or not. Remember, he has been the victim of lots of gossip about our, main gal here, Livia. And Livia is gone, what I described last chapter as full Jesus, right? She's fully committed to Jesus. Publius is
full Jesus.
I really wanted to sound cool, but it does not work that well. But anyways, you know what I mean. And when the chapter opens here, we find ourselves in year 33, right? So when the chapter opens with year 33, Passover, some of us already go, oh my goodness, this is the piece, right? This is it. And then it narrates the whole Passover. It spends a little bit of time talking about how Jerusalem swells up because everybody in that world is making its way to Jerusalem, so much so that they even have to redirect some of the armies, right? The Roman armies from other places to make sure that the peace holds. So the way I think of it is like, think about the greatest sports event that we can possibly think on our days, add them to all the other events together, and this is it. This is what's happening. The entire world is going to Jerusalem that day. So just imagine the confusion, right? Mm-hmm. We see Jesus triumphal. We're told about his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We know that this chapter he gets arrested. We also know, I'm going to skip ahead a little because we'll talk about the details. We know that Pilate has a challenge at his hand. He brings people together, which is really interesting to kind of counsel him on what's going to happen. We know that he's sent to, they don't know what to do with him. They don't really think that Jesus is guilty of anything, but there's political considerations. They send him to Antipas, Herod Antipas, which was one of the rulers of the area. And because he was from Galilee, he was the ruler of the Galilee, they figured they can kind of toss the ball over to him. He tosses the ball back, making things even worse, forces their hand, and eventually they decide to have Jesus receive lashes to see if that's going to quell the hunger for blood from the people. He does take a beating. It does not quell the public sentiment, and then decided that they have to execute somebody so people will calm down. They have this idea that maybe they can substitute Jesus for somebody else since he's not guilty. They put that choice out to the people, and lo and behold, we know what happens. The people chooses Barabbas, right? And we'll talk in more details. And we also see the traditional scene of, like, you know, Pilate washes his hands and goes into history. And we also find out something really interesting, which we already knew. All his main guys, his main disciples, Jesus, that is, they're all nowhere to be found. Only the women are near him, right? And that ends chapter 8 in the jiffy. So yes, I think that we need to add a couple more hashtags to our piece here, but that's kind of a quick recap. What do you guys think? Anything that I missed, or anything else that you want to toss in terms of recap before we dive into passages that we've liked?
I think that's, yeah, I think you sum really well. The part of the history, it's something that amazed me to read something that it's not in the books, but you know that it's from someone that was there. And not only Emmanuel, you can see from the eyes of Livia and all of the people that was in that moment. Yeah, it's like, I think it's the worst day in human history. So, right? But,
yeah.
Well, it happened.
Yeah.
And so, you know how I have this habit of renaming our chapters. So let me be really honest. I have a lot of education, too much education. Like it's useless. I say that not to talk about like my actual educational background. I have a doctorate in education, but I actually had to look up the word Calvary. And I wanted to say that because there might be somebody else out there who had the same problem. And so I looked it up on my phone just now, Webster's dictionary, because you said, you know, this is a really important title. I have the habit, if you've been watching us, of renaming the titles. So I renamed it, and I'll tell you what I did in a minute. But Calvary, for those of you who also thought you needed to look it up, the Merriam-Webster's dictionary has two definitions. The first one is an open-air representation of the crucifixion of Jesus. Makes sense. Calvary, crucifixion of Jesus. That's how it's being used here. The other is an experience of usually intense mental suffering. And then they also talk about it as a place outside of Jerusalem, sort of synonymous with Golgotha.
The Golgotha, yeah.
But anyways, I had to look that word up. So in case anyone was out there and you were like, what's the title? What? That is what it means.
And Golgotha, if I remember this correctly, I'm not wrong. It means a place of the skulls. Like it's a flat place that
That is what it says
Yeah.
in here somewhere. Alex, you're probably faster finding it than me, but that is how it's actually in chapter 9, how they define it as they're walking to Golgotha.
141.
Which page?
141 at the end.
See, look at that. I knew it. Golgotha, the place of the skulls.
Mm-hmm. And you know, the place of the skulls obviously does not bode well, because you only had skulls at a place where people have died, right?
Yeah.
So it's a place of execution. It's a place where this normally happens. And we should also stop right there. And since we're talking about it, that the crucifixion today, the crucifixion crosses for us have come to take a very specific meaning with Christ. But what they were really meant to do at that time was to be the lowest and least honorable possible way of execution.
Yeah.
Right. To be nailed to a piece of wood and basically hung. So it was very, very unhonorable, and only thieves would really deserve that kind of faith. So we see that has been transformed with time, right? But that's something interesting for us to talk about as well.
And we'll hear more about that in the next chapter, because it's Simeon.
Yes.
But so you might be wondering, maybe you already forgot, you might be wondering though, Nicole, what did you name this chapter?
What did you name this chapter, Nicole?
Thank you for asking. It actually reminded me of Martin Luther King has a famous quote, and it says, "In the end, what people remember are not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And
that's a very long chapter name.
I renamed it "Words of Enemies" or "Silence of Friends."
Okay.
I know it was needed.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Absolutely. So I'll read the quote just the way it is here, because I don't want to butcher it. But it comes from Martin Luther King. And his exact quote is, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And here's what I thought about this, because obviously what Emmanuel is living with is his silence, right? We see these short glimpses of both Publius Lentulus and of Pontius Pilate having this doubt, but not wanting to stand up and rock the boat. And so the words of the mob is what ultimately pushes to Jesus' crucifixion, right? He says, like, "I will give the crowd what they want." You know, he keeps trying to like wash his hands. He doesn't want to get involved. He remains silent. He doesn't take a position on it. And so it's really an interesting moment where we see history repeat itself, right? We go back to like the civil rights movements. We've had a lot in this book talking about slavery, civil rights, all of these things. And so in this chapter specifically, it just reminded me of Martin Luther King and the silence of our friends, and how as a friend of Jesus, as a friend of this work, you know, how can we not be silent? And it is a really long title, but again, I didn't know what Calvary meant.
I think you should go for the silence of our friends.
All right.
I think that would be a better chapter name. I might be the editor of your chapter names from now on.
Hired. I'll keep you around.
Anyway, so I think it's a great point, because I think that's a very difficult piece, right, in general to digest, and we can talk a lot about. I think this is one of the themes that we might want to discuss, but I also want to put us back to the piece that you were talking through, which is, how did Jesus get to be crucified, right? Because we hear in the beginning, somewhat in the beginning of the chapter, that Anna, the slave, right, the home slave, a servant, tells us that Jesus was welcomed with reverence, basically, as he enters Jerusalem. So I find that an incredibly beautiful contrast in many different ways. He comes in, people have palms, right? They decorated, they all seeing this great prophet that more and more people are convinced he is.
And that's on page, if you're following along, on what page 131. It says, "All the windows were decorated with flowers for his triumphal entry. The children spread green scented palms in the path in homage of him and his disciples." So many people were there. It was really, really beautiful.
And there's another passage that says that even among the most disbelieving people in the city, the resurrection of Lazarus in Bethany confirmed his divine merit as the Son of God, and I heard that he's arrived, brought immense joy to everyone, right? So the word is out. He's done so many miracles, so many things that a lot of people are swaying to the belief that he is the prophet.
Yeah.
And then what we learned later through on again is that he's been arrested, right? And that's a fascinating, unexpected piece, right? That it kind of just happened. And if we move forward a little bit, we are going to see a couple of comments, which I'm trying to find him, right? There's a comment about the fact that, you know, he's just a visionary. He hasn't really done anything political, they comment. I don't know if you guys remember that part.
Yeah.
Frankly, I can find
There
no
it is.
guilt in him at all, except for that of a fervent
134.
visionary of things to come or not. Page 134, all the way on the bottom of the page. So
Yeah, and in 135, if you go a little bit forward, Publius starts to, because remember, Publius is summoned to see Pilate, because Pilate is bringing all the patricians, all the Roman citizens of power together, because he knows this is a big thing going on. And so he wants to be sure, as a good and shrewd politician, that he's got cover, right? That nobody's going to throw him under the bus and say, it was his fault afterwards, right? Because there's no wonder he's a governor of Judea. Right? He knows how to operate politically, right?
Yeah.
And then on the bottom of page, I think 135, potentially, he says, and then this is when Publius asked about Jesus. Did you meet him while you're there? He says, I myself met the prophet of Nazareth up close in Capernaum. Not one there thought of him as a conspirator or revolutionary. His actions there were those of a superior man, charitable and just. And I never heard anyone say, here's the interesting part, that he spoke against any social or political institution of the empire, right? And I want to say that because I think that's a really important piece for us to understand, because we forget this because we live in a society where there is a separation of church and state. We take this for granted. But for the Jewish world back there was no such separation, right? Religion was the government and government was religion. And so that's why they mentioned that he never spoke any, social or political institutions. Basically, the reason why you would go into organized religion would be to serve God, but also to have, temporal earthly powers. So much so that the Jews were waiting for a prophet that would come and reorder the world, even in a political sense too, right? So whenever they're seeing these prophets come up, what they're really worried, it's not whether the prophet is of divine nature, is whether the prophet is fomenting a social revolution.
Yeah, because you got to remember the Romans had many, many gods, and they kept sort of adding a new one, adding it like it was.
Yeah.
They actually, as they conquered people, they would take on like as a courtesy, like, oh sure, your God can be part of our crew. And
the Romans don't care about what you believe in as long as you don't rock the boat, right? So from the Roman here saying like, but he might be like a little cuckoo. He might think about things, but he's never done anything to really, revolutionize anything.
And I think this is an interesting point, is that in this case, Publius Lentulus talks about almost about like the historical Jesus, right? He's not necessarily talking about like the religious figure Jesus. He's talking about the historical person of Jesus, and he calls him a superior man who, doesn't rock the boat. And I feel like that is interesting, because here's not necessarily a fervent believer or somebody who is in strong support, but even someone who's almost on the neutral side calls him a superior man. And even, Pontius Pilate, up until this moment, I never realized how conflicted Pontius Pilate, like truly deeply conflicted, because on page 137, it says, the dire situation saddens me greatly because my heart tells me that this man is innocent, but what can we do in such a case?
Yeah.
Right. Like there actually is this true conflict, and the mockery that is made of Jesus is in stark contrast to what we saw on page 131. So on page 136, all the way at the bottom, it says, Jesus is mockingly dressed in a royal tunic, crowned with a crown of thorns, holding a reed as a symbol of the kingdom of the world. So such a juxtaposition to page 131, where we see the palm leaves in the streets, where we see people sort of awaiting him, throwing flowers, like treating him as a king, to this like juxtaposition.
And to your point, it's interesting because I'm reading another book. It's I don't know if there's a version in English. It's called No Roteiro de Jesus. It's not from Emmanuel. It's from, I forgot the spirit right now, but I can put that on the comments later. And there's one story that says narrates how they got to get a confession to get Jesus in a bad way political, right? Because they did not have anything like Pilate says, like Publius says, that they do not have that from the Jesus mouth on everything that he said, that they was going to change or rock the boat, like we're saying. So they had to do something to get that confession from Judas through money and everything. And it's really interesting because they need like to fake something to get their arrest.
And that book, I think is by Umberto de Campos. And through the mediumship of the same medium, Francisco Xavier. And I think going back to that point, we do have a paragraph here in this chapter that's very telling to that piece that you were talking about. And it's a couple of, I think it's a page over what I was just sharing about, like when he says that he has met the piece, right? So it's probably 136 or 137. And it starts with the chapter starts with nicknamed. Can you guys find that?
136.
Yeah, nicknamed King of the Jews by the simple folk and symbolizing the political hopes of a number of his followers, among them the famed disciple of Iscariot, the master of Nazareth, was treated by the prince of Tiberias as a common conspirator, humiliated and defeated. So what we get a hint here is that we get some insight into the psyche of Judas too, right? Judas was also a political animal. And if we interpret this, we learn that what Judas was doing is he was hoping that Christ would get arrested, and that would trigger the political revolution that would then lead to Christ becoming the governor of things in a political sense, right? It's not that he betrayed Jesus himself because he didn't believe in Jesus, because he felt like that could start a political movement that would fulfill history, right? He had this perspective of, again, temporal power, which is what was prevalent in the time, and which is Jesus came to exactly go against and say, my kingdom is not of this world. I don't care about, political power. I care about spiritual transformation, right? But that's a great point that we see throughout this chapter. I feel like in many different ways is this, just like you said with Pilate, it's this just a position of earthly power versus spiritual sense. Which one do we do? And that's the biggest message that I take away from that chapter, which is this Pilate moments that we all have. Do we have moments just like Pontius Pilate where we know that something is wrong and we try to find ways to make it right, but then we stop at one point in time because it doesn't benefit us, right? So it's an interesting interesting perspective in general, right? So that's one thing that I kind of take away from this whole piece in general, from this chapter that really stayed with me. And I asked myself, what's happening there? Because we also learn here, did you guys pay attention to that fact that Publius played quite a bit of a role in helping Pilate reach his conclusions, right?
Yes, because I thought about that because Publius was like in kind of way in a higher position than Pilate, right? Because he was a center of the Rome. He has the Caesar backing him to be there and everything. So he's getting Publius' perspective and his opinion and everything that he did. And every time that Publius throughout the chapter, we see that he like agrees, like, we did everything you can. I think you are correct. He always like assuring pilots that he's doing the right thing. Like, you try everything. So now what you can do? So it's kind of like washing his hands too, because he thinks that they need to give Jesus to his people because they do not need to interfere or something like that, right?
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing, because if you were not for this book, one could leave with the idea that the whole decision was just Pilate, whereas Pilate was also checking with other people who were also backing him up on that decision of put your interests first, right?
And another point is, like, if you just read the Bible and the stories that we know from the Bible and so on, we do not think that that he tried so hard not to do anything with Jesus, right? Because I remember when I was young, I always thought that, like, they want to get Jesus crucified, or they just don't care, in a way that was more like, let's go over with this. And we see on the book, like, he really tried to find a way, but he doesn't want to get involved in
that piece.
And there's an interesting summary of all the steps he took on page 140 at the bottom. He says, first of all, the prisoner was sent to be judged by Antipas. All right. And then he says, then you settled on like lashes as punishment, but like that didn't make them happy. So then like the crucifixion was supposed to take place. Like then we offered to crucify somebody else instead. And like now here we are. So
and he got the worst guy that he had to put with Jesus. Like, he did not get just anyone. So he got the worst one that he knew that the people did not like, because he thought that they will choose Barabbas instead.
And I there's one sentence in the next paragraph from what you wanted to read that stuck to me, because I think that's the sides, like, tell us about the mindset, right? It says, and then Publius continues and says, as a man, I am against this unconscionable and wretched people, and would do anything to save an innocent, right? But as a Roman, I believe that a province such as this one is no more than an economic unit of the empire, right? So he's saying, this is a business transaction. We must keep the peace because we take tons of money from this area back into the empire. And at the end of the day, that's what matters, right? No more than an economic unit of the empire. So it's almost like a disdain from morality and saying business interests come first, in a language that today we could understand.
About it, today it's not so different from there, right? Because we still have like power and money governing the world, even so that we know that some countries do something wrong, but for business sakes, we're still doing business, and that's the way we still kind of.
And that's the question of our times, right? That we ask ourselves, and I mean the same things, and we say, like you were saying, Nicole, that Pilate is really struggling, right? Because he's putting his hands in his face and he's thinking, and he's rushed through this by that political aid. Remember Polybius, right? That comes in and has been coaching him through the piece and saying, hey, you've got to make a decision, governor, because these guys are going to come and storm the palace. Right. So there's also a matter of security, and they're like, well, better him than I, kind of thing, right?
And that's the other thing that we do not get from the Bible, right? Because I never thought that they would try to like overtake the palace. Because we had like legions there, the centurions and everyone there. So it's like, would be a huge thing for them to do that, right?
And we always hear about the fact that, in those final days, Jesus was alone. And you mentioned it in your summary early on. But I did think it was interesting. And even Publius Lentulus mentioned up until the moment, the last page of the chapter 142, he said, up until the moment he left bearing the cross, no one showed an interest in Jesus before the authority of the governor of Judea. From this, the senator concluded that the many who had followed the Master of Nazareth on the shores of the lakes in Capernaum had forsaken him entirely.
Mhm.
And we know they hadn't forsaken him, but I do think it's interesting. And Emmanuel has a book of little messages, and I forgot which one it was. I want to say the one it's like Living Fountain, where there's a passage that says like, not even for 1 hour were you vigilant with me, right? Like
it's a quote by Jesus. Yeah. And in those days, actually, really similar to those days.
Correct.
Yeah. Mhm.
Like it is right before this moment. So
Yeah.
like, it's like this moment that like, where is everybody? And I know that we know that like at the master's side, like a paragraph lower, one no longer saw the loving cares of his disciples and numerous followers. Only a few women among the impressive and agonizing figures of his mother stood out, supporting him tenderly in his painful and final ordeal. Like, so his mother is there.
And that's a question that I was asking myself. Where are the followers of Jesus that received him into the city? And my theory here is simple. Publius is looking for people. He's saying nobody came to talk to us. Like nobody of stature and political capital came to tell us that they are behind Jesus, right? Because that's all he knows. But the followers of Jesus were no such people. They have followed him. And we see earlier on that they say that they have followed him from far away, right? And a lot of people follow him. And they stayed outside of the city in the Mount of Olives, right? So the followers, the simple folk that really care about him, they did not care about politics and all this stuff. They stayed away from all this, hoo-ha and all this noise and everything else. So the people who were yelling and clamoring for Barabbas were those few vocal minorities that were in the pockets of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees more specifically. They were that gang that was there for political reasons, just to kind of agitate, because the crowd that was really following Jesus had learned that these things of temporal importance were not really what was all about. They were a simpler crowd.
Well, and in chapter 9, we also hear there's a moment where it says that, the people were scared to be there. Like they were worried that they would be ambushed and killed as well. And in that moment, what you said, like that was not the fight.
And nothing takes away from the beautiful women of the gospel, because I'm always touched by the women at the gospel, right? At the stories that we hear the gospel, because they're always incredibly courageous in a time that it was even harder for them to be courageous, right? And we see obviously Mary, the mother, right, of Jesus there, but their dedication and their steadfastness, and we see this with Livia too, right? She makes some tough decisions about whether she's going to leave the house without talking to her husband and go after to the palace and beg, right?
Well, let's jump there now, because we've talked for a long time about chapter 8. Let's hop into chapter 9.
Slender, victorious. And so here we learn that slender will have its day, and it does.
I just called this chapter Boo.
Boo.
Boo. Boo. Sorry, team. You were looking for something deep, but all I came up with was boo.
Boo. Or Fulvia wins is also a good chapter, right?
I don't know if she wins. It's just boo. Like Jesus is dying. Like Olivia is like torn down. Publius is like his worst. Boo.
Yeah. But toward the end, we kind of end up in a high note, because we got, from Livia's perspective, all the grandeur of Jesus passing.
Yes.
So that is a bonus in this chapter. So
for sure. And let's talk about that. But before we do, quick recap for our folks who have read it a long time ago or have not fully read it just yet. Really simple. Couple of spoilers. And we know here that Jesus is in trouble. Anna and Simeon from Samaria, remember that the old uncle of Anna, come to Livia and asking, hey, Jesus is in trouble. Can you go, because you have status, can you go help, right? Livia agonized for quite a bit because Publius is not there. She doesn't know where he is. She decides to be like totally uncharacteristic of her, right? She decides she's just going to go for that. She feels like she has to go for that and ask for help at the palace. Key moment, she dressed up in her Galilean clothes again to get out of the palace, not to call attention on herself, because she's trying to be considerate to Publius' position. So she thinks that she's not, working against him by doing that. She gets there, surprisingly. Probably all the soldiers are worried about keeping the peace. She can make her way relatively easy into the palace. She sees Sulpicius, which I like to call Sulpicius, who sees her. She asks for help. And then he really thinks that she's having an affair because he can only see what he does. And what he does is want to have affairs, right? So generally we can only see in other people what we do. And so he decides to take her to one of Pilate's love nests, a secret room in which he has his affairs, or a private office, and have her wait there full of perfumes and so forth. Now, this is when it gets worse. Fulvia sees both of them at a distance and now really thinks that she can kind of get one up and do what she wants, and go tells Publius, which she knows is in there. Remember, because she's the sister of Claudia, Pilate's wife, so she has full access, right, to the palace.
And
she goes over there.
Know that he was there.
Yeah, right. And so she goes and talks to him and says, "Well, come on, I'll take you to her right now, so you can see that she's cheating on you." And him, in a moment of like, "Well, you crazy? Well, I can't go into another citizen's house without being invited, like into a respectfully piece." And she's like, "You don't have to. Just look down this window. You're going to see her leaving the palace." He looks outside, sees her leaving the palace after she's had an encounter with Pilate. She's dressed in Galilean clothes. He then finally makes a connection in his brain that she's leaving the palace. She didn't tell him, so she must have been having an affair with Pilate. And that's why she was dressed with the Galilean clothes before. So this affair has been going on for a while. His heart shatters. He makes his back home. But in the same time, Livia meets Pilate. She begs for help. Pilate says, "Sorry, no can do anything for Jesus."
But what can you do for me lately?
And then he gets hormones acting up, and he tries to basically jump her. He grabs her, right? And then she kind of speaks up for the first time. And that's a great sentence that's very uncharacteristic of her. She says, "Step back, sir." Right? She basically commands. So I like that, like, "Step back, sir," because he has grabbed her hand. And then he feels like he really wants to kind of like, he's so like enthralled by her. But there's also a sentence that says, like, by some unknown force or whatever it is, he just doesn't act on it. So we see there's spiritual connection here. Like, Livia has got spiritual backup. And that's why nothing happens to her in there. Because otherwise he would just force.
Team Livia supporting her.
Team Livia, spiritual team Livia is definitely there, which we talk about later on as well in the chapter, right? But they go back home. She starts praying, and this is the part that I totally agree with Alex. We have an inside scoop into what happened at the Golgotha. Because remember, they have rented this little house because they have gone to the city in hopes of finding their kid. Because since everybody was going to be in Jerusalem, it would be easier to find the kid if they were there, because everybody would make their way there. And from the house, she can kind of see at a distance the Golgotha, where the crucifixion is taking place. And she has a spiritual experience in which basically she detaches from her physical body, and she is taken to watch the scene of the crucifixion. And I totally agree with Alex here. This is the hardest part, but it's also a beautiful piece. And then we get to see what happens from the spiritual perspective. And that's one of the takeaways for me. But does that sound like a fair assessment so far?
Yeah. Yes.
Then her husband comes home.
Yeah.
And basically threatens to kill her.
Yes, which is completely crazy, right? I think this is when we should bring back the other hashtag we had, which was, "What was that, Publius?" Right? Because it's incredibly like crazy. First of all, do you guys agree? Like, he didn't ask her at any point in time, right? What happened? He comes back and talks to her and says, "I don't want you to say a word."
Yeah.
Right. I'm just going to tell you, right? I'm a really nice guy. I am really cool. So I'm not going to have you killed, basically, this time. But if you misbehave, you will, because I respect even animals who have, offsprings, and you're a mother. So that's all you're going to be. You're going to be a slave. You cannot leave the palace without things. You cannot do anything. By the way, you will no longer have a say in the education of your daughter, right? So he takes away her daughter from her as well, right? he becomes despicable.
Hence the chapter is called Boo.
Boo, for sure.
Boo.
Right? And that's an incredible piece. And that's when I think that we go back to the spiritual piece, because we see at the end that while she's completely like, she's lost her husband, she's lost her first kid, she's lost her second kid, she's lost everything at this point in time, right?
She's lost the spiritual guidance and inspiration. She thinks like the spiritual guidance.
But we
gone,
see that there's an angel,
physical.
right? The last sentence of the paragraph, it's a beautiful one. It says,
an angel of peace, however, was watching over her with the sweetness of sentinels that never leave their post of love, redemption, and mercy.
Yeah. So we know, yeah. Go ahead.
Causing the balm of hope to trickle into the chalice of her anguished heart. This luminous spirit made her feel that she was not dispossessed, that she had the treasure of faith, and that united her to Jesus, to the Messiah of selflessness and salvation, who was waiting for her in the kingdom of light and mercy.
Right. So what I take away from that piece, I think, is one of the topics or themes of this chapter is there's always invisible help. There's always things happening in our lives, but there's always help behind it. And I think it goes back to what Alex was saying, which was what really happened at the Golgotha from a spiritual perspective. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, Alex, because I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, I was really fascinated. And I think what I take from here is like, we have in the same room the two sides, right? One person that is not even trying to control himself, right? He's just letting his emotions go through him. Even saying that when he goes to the room, and this got my attention, he noticed that she's having something, right? Because it says that he never saw her so beautiful as that moment. And even in that, he just like, I think they use, what's the, let me try to find the, Livia had never seemed so spiritualized and beautiful to him as in the moment, but the demon of slander made him immediately sense that her weeping was nothing more than a sign of remorse and contrition for the wrong she had committed. He had his mind set that she was doing something wrong. And in the other point, we have someone that is, she went through that whole speech of him trying to control herself, and we see some moments that she was kind of wavering, and then that angel that we saw at the end, like trying to guide her thoughts and like, wait, be calm. And every time that she was wavering, that she got some help, because she was trying to get herself composed for that. And that's what I take from here. I think every time that we do not stop, and that's why we pray a lot, because I think when we stop to think and get to ourselves, then we can reach out to that help that is always there to give us a hand, right?
Yeah. And I think that the one way for us to maybe wrap up this chapter or begin to in a positive way, at least for me, is to exactly go back to the line of the spiritual help that is always present.
Yeah.
And we have a little bit of insight into that by the description of Livia, of what is happening on the Golgotha from a spiritual perspective, right? We have I don't know what page it is, but it starts with suddenly she felt touched by a wave of indefinable consolation.
Page
right?
156.
Yeah. Right.
In the middle.
And I'm going to read this passage. It's a little long, but I think it's worth reading. It seemed that the stifling Jerusalem air was filled with indescribable melodious vibrations. Remember, it was really cloudy. It's basically like a tempest is going to rain kind of weather to describe.
The storm is coming.
Yep. In rapture, she saw through her eyes of her spirit that the great cross of Calvary was surrounded by numerous lights. So what lights are these? Are normal lights, because there were no lights, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
in the uncommon heat of that day. So it's really hot, right? Really dank. Dark clouds had gathered in the atmosphere, foretelling a storm. In just a few minutes, the entire celestial canopy was filled with thick darkness. Basically, what we have is almost like a cinematographical situation here where the dark clouds are just gathering around Christ. And it seems like it's a movie, right? Olivia saw that between heaven and earth, a long pathway had opened up on which legions of graceful winged beings were descending toward Golgotha. So imagine in the darkness, this group of spirits just coming down, right? And how many, you may ask? And the answer is thousands of them. Thousands of them gathered around the Master's cross and seemed to transform it into a fount of everlasting radiant light. So we have this incredibly depressing situation on the earthly side where everything is dark and it's going to rain. And we have this most beautiful and undescribable situation in the spiritual realm where thousands of spirits, of incredible spirits who no doubt have been following Jesus' footsteps throughout his journey on earth, finally get to come closer because this is the culminating moment of his teachings for us, right? When he's literally going to give his life, which is something that we, when we think with our earthly thoughts, prize the most, right? He's going to give what we prize the most because that's not the most important piece, right? And then she feels her detached. She flies over there. Beautiful moment happens. To make a long story short, she, even though he's suffering, he's bleeding, she never sees him so beautiful and resplendent, right? That's because she's now seeing with the eyes of the spirit. She can see Jesus better, and Jesus is even more beautiful from a spiritual perspective. And then in the moment that she's like knowing that he's going to die, she thinks, oh my God, what you described before, I no longer will have his support or this piece. And it seems that for a fraction of a second, he veers his eyes towards her from the cross, and she feels an overwhelming love, right? Yeah. And at a particular moment, her spirit was overcome by an indefinable consolation, as if she were touched by the greatest joy of her life, right? Big words for that moment, right?
Yeah.
She noticed that the Master had turned his gaze slightly, resting it on her in a wave of indescribable love and luminous tenderness. In the final torments of death, those serene and merciful eyes seemed to say to her, my child, wait for the eternal light of my kingdom, because on this earth, this is how we all must die. It is so moving in many different ways, right? Yeah. It's everything that I feel the message of the Christ is about. Listen, this physical world is not the end all be all of things. There will be pain, there will be suffering, and we all are going to do this, and you too will be able to do what I do, because we don't see this yet, right? But we know the story. He's going to come back, so to speak. And I think that's the message, right?
Shocking.
Oh, spoiler alert, right? He's going to resurrect, so to speak, right? And I think that we focus a lot on his suffering, on his message. We think of a bloody Jesus on the cross. But for me, personally, and I think that's why it's so beautiful, is that his message, his fundamental message is one that he has won over death. Yeah. That death was not the end of him, that he lived on and came back, spiritually speaking. And that is the good news. So I think that's a beautiful piece about all that.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that's a better place to end than the shouting of Publius, which we already touched on. Right. I did want to point out something, because I know the two of you did not miss this part, but people at home watching may have jumped over because it's just a paragraph long, and it's a paragraph on page 154. So a little bit before this scene, when, you know, Anna is crying, Simeon is with them, everybody's weeping, they can't save Jesus. And Anna is like, we will never see Jesus of Nazareth again, and he won't ever comfort his heart again. And Simeon, who, I mean, I knew he was a cool guy, but like he doesn't have a big part in the book, but he says, what are you saying, my child? Simeon said resolutely, don't you know that the Master assured us that his consoling presence would continue among those who gather in his name now and forever? Also cool, but it gets cooler.
Yeah.
Then he says, when I go back to Samaria, I will put a cross on the door of our hut, and there I will gather a community of believers who want to continue the loving tradition of the Messiah.
Yes.
Like, what a cool
He gets
moment
it.
of like, and all of a sudden, like,
He gets it.
all I think about is like in that moment, the birth of like all churches to follow, putting up a cross. Here is Simeon in that moment
Yes.
saying, I will put a cross, a symbol that used to be for the worst the thieves, the murderers. I will put that symbol and reclaim
Proudly,
it
yeah.
and put it on my hut. And that there we will gather
Yes.
to talk about Jesus. Like, it's just such a beautiful
Yes.
moment. Like, all these other pieces are great too, but here's this simple, humble man that we would have never heard about if it hadn't been for this book. And it's just like, there he goes, like putting a cross up.
Yeah, and I think it's such a beautiful insight that you bring to us, because you have to remember that he's from Samaria, right, which is up north, and he has made his way all the way down into Judea. Remember that the Samaritans were not well loved by the Jews. He's taking risk to go there, and he's older. He says, like, maybe because I'm closer to death, right? But I get it. So he gets it. Yep. And I think that goes back to what Alex was saying right in the beginning, which is the saddest day in history, but maybe it's the most beautiful day in history, because when we lose Jesus, we begin to stop listening to him and try to act like him, right? Some of these souls start saying, you know what? Like, we got to carry on everything that we learned with him. And he does exactly that. And what a powerful symbolism that you bring to us, Nicole, because Jesus transforms everything. Yeah. Jesus transforms our perception of what the world is and points us to the spiritual, just like he transformed the most horrible symbol for thieves into the most sacred of shapes nowadays, right? Yeah. So his presence touches in so many different ways. And I got to be honest with you, I love Simeon. He's just an incredible little man who's just does wonders, right?
That's true. Yeah, it's a nice passage and a nice historical fact, right? Because like, looks like he was one of the first to make the cross a symbol, or something different than it was.
I gotta say that today flew by. It's been an hour already that we've been chatting.
Yes.
Yes.
I can't believe it.
And we could have talked more, especially about, I would have talked a lot more about the actual, like the arrest of Jesus and these dialogues that we have,
There's
which are beautiful.
Lot in these two chapters, which is good news. Next week, we're only reading one chapter. We're reading chapter 10, which takes us to the end of section one.
Part 1.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Because it's a long chapter too, right?
It is a long chapter. The chapter is...
You've read already, almost half of the book, right?
Yep. I think that by
chapter is 40 pages long.
Yep. I think that we are like about 35% of the book. I think when we read that, we're going to be close to almost half of the book. Yeah. It goes by quick. And this is just meant to be really an appetizer. There's so many wonderful passages and things in there. We welcome everybody's input. They can make comments on YouTube. They can also go to Spiritism Online and find the book club in there. And there's forums I can add, because there's no way that we can just really exhaust the topic in with just 1 hour, right?
And again, we'll post resources, links to different Facebook sites and different things in the comments. And if you're feeling courageous enough, join us like Alex, because Alex is awesome. We really missed you last week.
We did, Alex.
We really, really did. You'll hear us talk about you when you watch the video. We're like, where's Alex?
Where's Alex? It could be a hashtag.
Yeah.
Hashtag where's Alex?
Where's Alex?
I'm thinking of you guys.
Glad you were here.
Any parting thoughts, Nicole?
Not for my part.
Alex?
Alex usually has wisdom. Alex, final words.
Well, not much to say. I think we cover everything, but in the same way that so much left to talk about it. Well, what I've been thinking that it's always like the lessons that we need to learn from all this, because it's so many things that I feel that we're still doing and we're still struggling with, but well, that's why we're here.
Yep. Right. That's a great way to end with that questioning. Who are we? Are we Publius? Are we Pilate? Are we Livia? Are we a little bit of each one of them? What part of us is reflected here in this book, and what is it that we want to do about it. So maybe that's our homework for self-reflection there, and we hope to see everybody next week.
Same place, same time. Bye everybody.
Bye everyone.
Thank you guys. Have a good day.
Bye Alex. Have a good night.
Good night.